Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everybody is staying warm out there. Let me go ahead and get our presentation pulled up and we'll start our webinar. My name is Erin Suddeth and I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A program. And I have a colleague with me today.
Hi, I'm David Melanti, one of the assistant directors in the division.
Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. As always, if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, if you're joining us on Teams, you can go ahead and just put those in the chat. If you are watching through the media portal, you can email those to me at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And we do always post the recordings of our webinars and the PowerPoints on our Documents and Resources webpage within a day or so of recording. I do have kind of a new housekeeping announcement. We got some feedback recently on our survey that we keep open for the webinars, and we had some people request that if you're not presenting, if you could go ahead and turn your camera off as well as your mic. Sometimes something comes up, you need to take a phone call, and then through the corner of somebody's eye, they start to see movement and they get a little distracted. So just make sure that you've got your mics turned off and your cameras turned off. Recap from our October webinar. We always have a couple announcements and reminders. Our main two focuses were program documentation, in which we shared some updates that have been made to those monitoring checklists, which we always recommend districts and schools use as kind of a guide for what documentation they need to save throughout the year. And then we talked about updates to the guidance on district set-asides and shared some specific information about that. So if you weren't with us last month, be sure to go back and watch that recording. Today, we've got a couple announcements. Our big focus is going to be on comprehensive improvement planning and how that relates to Title I Part A. And we're going to talk a little bit about monitoring program implementation as well. Okay, our announcements. I know we do have a lot of new coordinators who've started in the recent months, and so some of you might not be familiar with all of the budget. I think somebody needs to mute themselves who just joined us. Thank you. So those of you who are newer, you might not be super familiar with all of those budget object codes and what expenses should be assigned to each code. There are some codes that are really similar and you might not know where to put things. So I have put a link in here to the chart of accounts and segment descriptions for the 22-23 year. It's a pretty big document, but if you go to page 34, you can just kind of see some descriptions of each of those codes, and that might help you figure out where the best budget code for one of your expenses may be. And then, of course, our 22-23 comparability report, that was due on November 1st. And thank you to everyone for your timely submission. We got all of them in pretty quickly, so we appreciate that. And our consultants are working to review those, approve them, send them back if there needs to be some corrections. And we do always like to remind, the same as with our GMAP applications, we do review these in the order in which they are submitted. So we always appreciate your patience as we're working through those. Everybody's got, quite a few districts that they're looking at. If your consultant has contacted you saying, hey, you need to make this little change or I need some clarification, please be sure to just get back to them and make any necessary revisions and upload that report back into GMAP so that they can go in and approve that as soon as possible. And then the last reminder for your comparability reports, your consultant probably told you this in your approval email, but make sure that you've saved those Infinite Campus enrollment summary reports and whatever staffing data you use to complete the report. You want to save those documents that align with the comparability report in the event that you've been selected for monitoring, and we will go in and we'll check and make sure that those are accurate. Okay, so our main focus, as I said before, is comprehensive improvement planning and Title I Part A. So we do have a comprehensive improvement planning timeline on a KDE webpage, and that just outlines the entire process. It's a collaborative process. There are a lot of different stakeholders who are involved in developing district and school improvement plans and then implementing them effectively and with fidelity. Title I Part A is one of the programs that should be involved in this process. The Title I coordinator is one of the stakeholders that should be at the table. Whatever needs and strategies are being identified during this improvement planning need to relate to how districts and schools are spending their Title I funds. So here's just kind of a recreation of that improvement planning timeline that I mentioned on our comprehensive improvement planning webpage. So you can see that it's broken down into 4 different phases, and there are different diagnostic tools that districts and schools should be working on during each phase. And these are all completed in the Cognia Continuous Improvement Platform. It used to be known as eProve, so you may have heard it referred to as eProve. And if you've reviewed the updated monitoring checklist that we talked about in last month's webinar, you might recall that these diagnostic tools like needs assessment, CDIP, CSIP, all of those are listed as examples of documentation for compliance. So we're going to look at a few of those diagnostic tools and explore exactly how they relate to the Title I Part A program. First up is the needs assessment. So what the needs assessment does is it takes a bunch of different data sources and determines where the school or the district is at currently, the current reality, and just kind of sets that baseline for starting to make some decisions about goals and strategies for the district or the school to implement that year. The document provides framework, and it's identifying the most critical areas for improvement that we're going to address during the planning process. So it's really just kind of the starting point for all of these things: goals, objectives, strategies, activities, everything. It all begins with the needs assessment. So how that relates to Title I, Code of Federal Regulations, 2 CFR 200.403A, that regulation states that for a cost to be allowable, it needs to be necessary for the performance of the program. We've also talked about in previous webinars and things how Title I Part A is a needs-based program. So, and I know you've heard this from us a bunch of times, all expenses need to be reasonable, allocable, necessary, and documented. So we're going to take a look at a couple of the guiding questions from our allowable cost checklist, which is available on our webpage, and how that kind of relates to the needs assessment. So the first question is, could the cost be deemed necessary for the operation of a quality, efficient Title I Part A program as outlined in the district's Title I Part A application? Is the need for the cost supported in the needs assessment, the CDIP, the CSIP, or a statement in your GMAP application? And what examples could be provided to any auditor to document the cost as necessary? So for anybody out there who's ever emailed or called their Title I consultant to find out if a particular cost is allowable, you can probably think back, and one of the first questions that your consultant would have asked you is that in your needs assessment? Is this expense addressing something in your needs assessment or your CDIP or your CSIP? So this document itself is a great piece of documentation that this expense was necessary for effective program implementation. So now we're going to look at the comprehensive improvement plans. That's our CDIP and our CSIP. And these are just some definitions. These came from our KDE Comprehensive Improvement Planning resources. I just went into the different diagnostic tools in the Cognia Continuous Improvement Platform, and I pulled out some key concepts for each term. Most of these have a lot more broad definitions. So I said this before, we're focusing on priority needs, funding, and closing achievement gaps between identified subgroups of students. First term is goals. So it's a long-term 3 to 5 year target based on whatever required school or district level goals there are, such as proficiency, achievement gap, transition readiness, those things. These goals are informed by the needs assessment. The needs assessment shows the district and the school the areas that need to be addressed, and then the goals outline how they'll be addressed. Within each goal, there is an objective or quite possibly multiple objectives that are going to support that goal. These are short-term targets that you're hoping to attain by the end of the current academic year. Within each objective is a strategy. And as I said before, just like goals can have multiple objectives, objectives can have multiple strategies. So these are based on an established improvement approach. An example of that would be Kentucky's 6 key core work processes. And you can find those on the Comprehensive Improvement Planning webpage. So those strategies are how you're going to systematically address whatever you're going to focus your efforts on, a process, a practice, anything like that, to help you reach those goals and objectives that align with your needs assessment. And then the activities are just those actionable steps that you're going to use to deploy the strategy that you've chosen. Just a couple more terms for CDIP and CSIP. We've got measure of success. That's where you're identifying some sort of observable criteria, which can show the impact of what you've been doing through those activities, strategies, objectives. And then progress monitoring. What process are you going to use to determine if the implementation of your plan is effective? This could include timelines, specific people who are responsible for different portions of the strategy or the plan. And then funding. You're supposed to list whatever funds are using to support the initiative. Is it local state funds? Is it federal funds specifically? Is it Title I funds, Title III funds? It can be a variety of things there. Okay, improvement plans and Title I Part A. So Section 1114B of the Every Student Succeeds Act does require that schools operating school-wide programs develop a comprehensive plan with input from stakeholders based on a needs assessment. Now, the CSIP serves as the school's Title I school-wide plan. Those of you who've maybe been around with Title I for a while, you may remember that a number of years ago, we did have a separate plan. And we got a lot of feedback that this matches the CSIP, or why are we doing the same work twice? So we did get rid of that plan and we said, you're right, it aligns with the CSIP. The CSIP is going to count as your Title I school-wide plan. Therefore, we should see Title I in the CSIP. So all of those requirements are just included in the CSIP. We don't need a separate plan. You want to make sure that you're being intentional when you're creating these plans in determining what you're going to support with Title I funds. You can try to indicate the amount of Title I funds being used to support the initiative right there in the CSIP or the CDIP. Obviously, it can just be an estimate, doesn't have to be an exact amount. Sometimes when we're monitoring, we pull CDIPs and CSIPs and we see maybe that funding source column is completely blank. No funding source has been mentioned, or maybe Title I funds has been listed in every single item. So in those scenarios, it's really difficult to demonstrate how needs are informing Title I purchases because there doesn't really seem to be that intentionality. Whereas if Title I funds have been specifically listed and an amount has been listed on the CSIP, there's really not a lot of room for ambiguity. It's pretty clear Title I is supporting this initiative. And we want to see clear connections between that needs assessment to the CSIP or CDIP and then to the GMAP application. So if the needs assessment identifies the issues, the CDIP and CSIP lay out the plan for addressing the issues, they break it down into steps, then the activities that have been identified as being funded by Title I should inform what's going into your GMAP application. And then of course the budgeted items on GMAP should be reflected in those documents, and then those will inform your munis budget. We did mention a minute ago measures of success and progress. The information provided on the CDIP and CSIP here is going to impact the documentation that you're going to save for your Title I program. So we're going to talk a little bit more about monitoring program implementation. As district coordinators, you are responsible for the oversight and monitoring of the Title I Part A program implementation at your participating public and private schools. I have two sub-bullets here. These are just kind of paraphrased from our district monitoring checklist. So during monitoring interviews, our consultants ask the districts how they verify if activities and strategies are occurring, how they work with schools on data analysis and program evaluation. The district needs to maintain evidence that these requirements are being met. And remember that the CDIP and CSIP include descriptions of how progress is going to be monitored, the criteria the district or school will use to measure success. So again, there should be that clear connection between information provided in your improvement planning diagnostics and your Title I program processes and documentation. Okay, processes and procedures. This is a big one. I know we've talked about it in some webinars before. So these are just two examples. Your district could be doing something different to monitor program implementation. And as we're going through these, if you want to leave a comment in the chat or share at the end of the webinar something you're doing other than this, that would be great. So what processes or procedures does the district have in place to monitor program implementation at the school level? So some examples of how you're monitoring program implementation at the school level could be examples of regular meetings. So how often are you meeting with your participating schools to discuss their programs? Are you meeting monthly, every other month? Keeping a standing meeting on your calendar helps ensure that these meetings are happening on a regular basis. Now, districts can choose to structure these meetings differently depending on what works for them, and that's absolutely fine. So some districts I know like to meet with all of their Title I principals at once, whereas others may choose to break the meetings down by the different grade levels of the schools that they're serving. Some may be able to meet with each school individually on a regular basis if it's a smaller district. Another example would be walkthroughs. These allow a coordinator to observe a specific program or activity in action. And this can be really beneficial at private schools since district staff aren't involved in the day-to-day operation of the private school. Okay, how are you documenting that you have these processes and procedures? So this is going to tie back to our June webinar where we talked about effective program documentation. So first one is meeting agendas and detailed meeting minutes. If the only documentation of a meeting having occurred is a short bulleted list with no list of attendees or summary of the information that was discussed, it isn't very strong evidence. So just as a reminder, here's what I said about meeting minutes during that June webinar. A meeting agenda that simply says Title I doesn't tell a story. What aspect of Title I was discussed at that meeting? You don't need a transcript of the entire meeting, but a few notes such as Title I coordinators shared that all schools have spent 50% of allocations, or invitation to participate in Parent Advisory Council was advertised via email, social media, and whatnot. The first meeting will be this date. Things like that that just provide a little more detail. You could also save some pertinent regular email correspondence. So some emails between the district and school could help demonstrate program oversight. A good example of this would be maybe regular email updates from either the coordinator or the finance officer to the principals regarding the amount of Title I funds that the school has spent. This is really demonstrating that you're making sure those funds are being spent in a timely fashion, that you're not going to have more than 15% carryover from year to year. There's also tools such as 30, 60, 90-day plans or a Plan, Do, Study, Act, PDSA. These different plans allow you to break down your project goals into more manageable chunks. So for a 30, 60, 90-day plan, it's what's going to be done in 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. This allows you to set deadlines, determine how the goals are going to be measured, identify next steps, and then assign tasks to individual people. The PDSA can be used to kind of organize processes into phases. First, you plan what's going to be done, then you actually do it, and then you study the implementation and effectiveness, and then you act on the information that you gathered during your study, and the process just begins again. And these are just two examples of some of the planning tools that we use at KDE. And I know we have some districts who use them as well, but there are definitely other tools out there that you could explore. Another piece of documentation would be walkthrough notes if you're doing walkthroughs. So similar to keeping meeting minutes, these walkthrough notes demonstrate that, number one, the walkthrough took place as planned, and then the notes can be shared with the principal or the teacher, whomever it is, during a meeting, and you can determine some next steps. Okay, so do we have any questions?
Nothing in the chat.
See, thank you for making that a part of a CSIP. I know everybody liked when we combined that into the CSIP. I'm going to check email real quick. All right, I don't see any questions on email, but of course, if you think of something after the fact, you can always email then. Our last announcement is just about the 2023 National ESEA Conference. We shared this last month. So this is going to be held February 1st through the 4th. It's hosted by the National Association of ESEA State Program Administrators, or NASPA. Once again, this year it's going to be a hybrid event, so you can join either virtually or in person in Indianapolis. There's over 100 sessions and 4 keynote speakers that cover a lot of the different challenges that are faced in education. Those of you who've been around a while may remember this by its former name, the National Title I Conference. They did update that because they've expanded it to include, all sorts of programs beyond Title I. There is additional information on the 2023 National ESEA Conference webpage, which is linked in your PowerPoint. Last month, we did put out an announcement that we were exploring being able to pay for up to 2 people from each district to attend, and we did have some people complete that survey and express interest. So you will be hearing from us soon on that. And then we just have one more webinar left for 2022. It's going to be on December 15th from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern, as always. And we do always like to remind you that we are always looking for feedback, and we want to learn what you want to hear in these webinars and newsletters and things. So if you have any comments, ideas, questions, anything like that, you can go to our anonymous webinar feedback survey, and there's always a link to that in the Title I newsletter. I'll double check for any more questions. All right, I'm not seeing any. So with that, I will say thank you for joining us this morning.